fellow Americans, buckle in, because what we are seeing in this imagined political scenario isn't just a headline or a spicy cable news chyron or the latest clickbait fodder for a dozen political content farms. It is a full-blown political earthquake. It is the kind of moment that forces the country to confront the gap between the mythology we construct around power and the cold reality that ultimately nothing built on fraud, intimidation, and gold leaf branding can outrun the slow, grinding machinery of law and accountability. The scenario opens with a narrator announcing the single most defining image of the 21st century, which is obviously rhetorical exaggeration, but the point is the symbolism. The seizure of property as the seizure of identity, the padlocking of buildings as the padlocking of a myth. The content frames it as a kind of cinematic comeuppance. And that's important because political commentary in the modern age is deeply cinematic. It isn't just about legal consequences, though it's about narrative justice. You'll notice how quickly the scenario jumps from facts to meaning. Federal marshals seizing Trump's real estate isn't treated as a simple legal action. It's treated as the crushing weight of justice collapsing on a man who thought the law was beneath him. That rhetorical move frames the entire scenario not as bureaucratic procedure, but as historical catharsis. And whether you love Trump, hate Trump, or are simply exhausted by Trump, the concept of catharsis is exactly how his political saga has been consumed by the country for nearly a decade. It has always been a melodrama built on plot arcs that demand resolution: the rise, the scandals, the impeachments, the indictments, the immunity rulings, the court battles, the financial entanglements, the foreign money questions, the whispers of corruption. The audience has been conditioned to expect a finale. Now let's talk about the method civil asset forfeiture. In the real world, civil forfeiture sits in this uncomfortable legal hinterland between justice and overreach. It's a mechanism designed for drug lords and racketeers, which is exactly what the narrator in the scenario leans into, because it maximizes the humiliation of the target. You're not just charged, you're stripped. Your lifestyle is repossessed. Your identity is dismantled. It's the legal version of ripping off the mask in a Scooby-Doo ending, except with federal marshals and financial crime statutes. And the scenario knows this, which is why it emphasizes not just the legal seizure, but the theatrical seizure. Barricades around Trump Tower, padlocks on Mar-a-Lago, federal agents cataloging computers and safes. What the scenario really wants to highlight is that Trump's wealth, or more precisely, Trump's brand of wealth, was never just about money. It was about spectacle. And spectacle is uniquely vulnerable to inversion. When the spectacle reverses, when the escalator becomes a crime scene, when the gold plating becomes evidence, when the chandelier becomes an exhibit tag, the story doesn't just punish financially, it punishes mythologically. Trump without luxury isn't Trump. Trump without branding isn't Trump. Trump without properties isn't Trump. For decades, the skyscrapers did the talking, projecting invincibility, dominance, and superiority. A brand built on glass and gold is ironically a brand made of very fragile material, which brings us to panic. Panic in political storytelling is never just panic, it's a signal of power decay. The scenario describes Trump screaming at his lawyers, demanding that they stop the steal, which flips his own political slogan back on him in a way that's almost taunting. The panic here is not about losing votes or losing polls or losing political capital, it's about losing leverage. One of the most important ideas in modern American political analysis is that leverage is the true currency of leadership, not money. You can be poor and powerful, rich and powerless, or rich and powerful, but you cannot be powerful without leverage. Trump's entire political existence has been fueled by leverage. Leverage against banks, leverage against media, leverage against his party, leverage against foreign leaders, leverage against courts through delay, leverage against prosecutors through spectacle. If the scenario imagines a world where federal marshals strip him of properties, they are in effect stripping him of leverage. A president without leverage is like a shark without movement. It dies quickly. Then comes the psychological dimension. The scenario insists that Trump is defined not by ideology, not by policy, not by populism, not even by grievance, but by identity rooted in material symbols. Trump Tower is not just real estate. Mar-a-Lago is not just a club. Bedminster is not just a golf course. They are shrines to the mythology that Donald Trump crafted for half a century. They are temples to the idea of Trump as tycoon. When the narrator says he is losing the things that define his existence, they are not being metaphorical. For a narcissistic public figure, and Trump's narcissism has been diagnosed, analyzed, memed, weaponized, joked about, and academically dissected, Identity collapse is existential collapse. The political version of this collapse has always been looming in the Trump narrative. It appeared in the bankruptcies of the 90s, in the revelations of the New York Times tax reporting, in the endless fights with Deutsche Bank, and in the financial restructuring that kept his empire upright. What the scenario does is push that to its logical extreme. The empire itself is seized, not refinanced. But now we get to the part that political vloggers love most, the money trail. Money is the Rosetta Stone of modern corruption. It explains the alliances, the betrayals, the foreign policy distortions, the regulatory decisions, and the opaque transactions that make up the deep fog of power. The scenario builds a fictionalized chain that links UAE money, crypto bribes, AI chip sales, foreign intelligence payments, and shell corporations into renovations and golf courses. Whether any of those details are plausible isn't the point. The point is that they illustrate the mechanism by which real-world corruption actually works. Corruption in the 21st century is rarely a bag of cash. It's architectural laundering. It's capital expenditures disguised as renovations. It's shell companies that invest in projects with inflated valuations. It's foreign sovereign wealth funds that move money under the guise of legitimate investment. And yes, it's crypto, because crypto is the great anonymizer. Political content creators have been obsessed with crypto corruption for years because crypto embodies the chaos of unregulated financial power intersecting with global politics. So when the scenario connects the digital to the concrete, blockchain to Bedminster, it is making a deeper commentary. Financial crimes are not abstract. They have physical footprints. They leave traces not just in ledgers, but in drywall. Then we get the betrayal angle, the silence of billionaires and the abandonment by loyalists. In real political crises, abandonment is often the final domino. Powerful people rarely fall because of external enemies. They fall because allies stop propping them up. The Nixon collapse wasn't about public disapproval, when it was about Republicans finally jumping ship. The Trump scenario imagines a similar dynamic. Musk, the Saudis, and other wealthy actors freezing instead of helping. The narrative calls Trump radioactive, and which is exactly the term financiers use in real situations. Political radioactivity is financial radioactivity. Investors, donors, allies. They don't like risk. They like power. And if power becomes expensive, they leave. That's the brutal truth of oligarch politics. Loyalty is a myth. Interest is real. Next comes the indictment of Republicans, not in court, but in credibility. The scenario argues that the seizure of Trump's assets is a retroactive indictment of the GOP's defense of his business acumen. And here's where we can zoom out to the meta-analysis. Modern conservative populism has been built in part on the worship of wealthy figures as avatars of capitalist success. Trump wasn't just a politician. He was proof that wealth equals wisdom. If the imagined scenario dismantles his wealth or reveals that wealth to be laundering disguised as success, then it dismantles the ideological foundation that so much of his appeal was built on. The scenario basically says, if he was a grifter, then everyone who sold him as a genius was either complicit or fooled. And political movements hate being fooled more than they hate being wrong. Now let's analyze the most provocative claim in the scenario, a president facing bankruptcy while in office. In geopolitics, that is the stuff of nightmares. A leader in personal financial crisis is arguably the single greatest national security risk, short of military mutiny. Why? Because leverage doesn't just come from assets, it comes from debt. If foreign banks, foreign sovereign wealth funds, or foreign private actors can call loans on a sitting president, then national policy can be hijacked by financial necessity. Political scientists have written for years that modern authoritarian corruption is often indistinguishable from oligarchic capitalism. In Russia, in Turkey, in parts of the Gulf, in Africa, in Central Asia, the state is the bank and the bank is the state. A bankrupt president is a weak president. A weak president with foreign loans is a compromised president. And a compromised president is a vulnerability to intelligence agencies, trade partners, and adversaries. Now, let's dig deeper into the psychological framing. The scenario explicitly calls Trump a narcissist whose collapse is inevitable. Again, whether that's fair isn't the purpose of analysis. The purpose is to understand why the narrator uses that framing. Narcissistic collapse is cinematic. It follows a script. Grandiosity, denial, rage, isolation, implosion. It mirrors Shakespearean downfall arcs. Vloggers love Shakespearean arcs because they turn politics into literature. A downfall without psychology is a spreadsheet. A downfall with psychology is content. And political content today thrives on narrative, not policy briefs. The scenario goes even further, introducing cannibalistic dynamics among GOP figures. J.D. Vance becomes the scapegoat. Betrayal is the currency of collapsing regimes. When political actors sense decay, they defect to salvage their own futures. It's not ideological, it's Darwinian. Then comes the discovery twist. Safe deposit boxes containing ledgers, the smoking gun. The smoking gun reveal is a staple of political monologue storytelling. It's the payoff moment. It's the archive dump. It's the Pentagon Papers. It's the Mueller report. It's the Epstein files. It's the leaked tapes. The ledgers link digital crime to physical crime and physical crime to presidency. In political narrative terms, this is the holy grail of scandal, a unifying theory. Audiences crave unifying theories because they hate loose ends. The scenario understands that instinct and uses the ledgers as the connective tissue that ties together money, power, presidency, and real estate. Whether such evidence would exist is irrelevant. Its symbolic power is what matters. Finally, we reach the populist justification. The narrator says the government is not stealing Trump's property. They are returning stolen property to the people. This is the language of anti-corruption politics worldwide, in Brazil, in South Korea, in Taiwan, in Italy, in Israel, in Malaysia. Populist anti-corruption movements use the frame of returning what was stolen. It is the moral inversion of elite capture. And it resonates because corruption is essentially theft. Theft of trust, theft of resources, theft of opportunity. The scenario concludes that democracy is fighting back, that the aura of invincibility is shattered, and that Trump ends as a man defined not by branding but by consequences. Whether that scenario ever becomes real is not actually the point. The point is that in American political culture, the myth of invincibility is always temporary. Every emperor has a finale. Every brand has a liquidation value. Every spectacle ends when the lights go out. And here's the thing about symbolic endings in politics. They don't just ruin the protagonist, they redefine the supporting characters. The imagined seizure in this scenario doesn't merely humiliate Trump, it humiliates the ecosystem that sustained him. And ecosystems, unlike individuals, do not collapse gracefully. They collapse violently, and they collapse in stages. First comes disbelief, then denial, then blame shifting, then fracture, then abandonment, and finally revisionist history. We've seen this pattern across regimes, across parties, across ideologies. When a populist strongman weakens, the loyalists transform into historians who swear they always had doubts. One of the most underrated aspects of political commentary, especially in the vlogger space, is tracking that metamorphosis in real time because it reveals what no ideology ever admits. Loyalty in politics is almost always transactional, and transactions expire. The scenario states that billionaire allies freeze, and that is exactly what happens when risk outweighs reward. Billionaires hate revolution. They love certainty. They tolerate chaos only when chaos delivers regulatory favors or capital gains. Once the chaos threatens the capital structure itself, their romance with insurgency ends. They don't want to get pulled into RICO cases or asset seizures. No amount of ideology is worth losing a yacht over. The same applies to foreign sovereign funds, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris. They are not sentimental investors. They don't invest in movements, they invest in leverage. If leverage disappears, so does their checkbook. It's not moral, it's math. Now let's talk about humiliation. Not personal humiliation, national humiliation. America doesn't handle humiliation well. This scenario imagines a moment where the most ostentatious symbol of American capitalism, the Trump-branded skyline, becomes a legal crime scene. That in itself is political humiliation, but it is also mythological humiliation because American exceptionalism has always relied on the belief that corruption is something that happens elsewhere. We point to Brazil, we point to Italy, we point to Russia, we point to South Korea, we point to Malaysia, and we say that's where leaders get arrested and properties seized and oligarchs exposed. The scenario flips that lens on us. It says, no, America is not immune to the oligarch cycle. America is not immune to financial authoritarianism. America is not immune to asset laundering through real estate. In fact, some of the largest real estate corruption pipelines in the world run through Miami, Manhattan, LA, and Palm Beach. This scenario just finally forces Americans to look at it without the patriotic fig leaf. There's also something fascinating about the way the scenario treats the Department of Justice. It frames DOJ not as bureaucrats, but as crusaders. Federal marshals are not portrayed as civil servants executing orders, but as heroic protagonists walking into gilded crime scenes to repossess the spoils of corruption. In real politics, institutions rarely get that kind of narrative glamour. Content creators usually prefer villains, or rebels, not marshals and judges. But in this scenario, the marshals are the revolutionaries. It's a reversal of political archetypes. The insurgent becomes the establishment, and the establishment becomes the insurgent. Trump built his brand on attacking the federal bureaucracy as the deep state, but here the federal bureaucracy becomes the agent of democratic accountability. It's almost poetic, and political poetry is rare. Then there's the fascinating question of timing. Political timing is everything. If such a scenario were to unfold during a presidency, the seizure of properties, the discovery of financial ledgers, the exposure of foreign money laundering, it would trigger cascading crises, cabinet fractures, congressional hearings, geopolitical recalculation, market volatility, security briefings, impeachment strategies, donor panic, and possibly countermeasures from the executive branch. A president in financial freefall might attempt to sell policy favors to secure liquidity. They might make diplomatic concessions for bailout guarantees. They might weaponize federal agencies to stall criminal liability. They might threaten allies, bribe enemies, or destabilize institutional checks. In other words, personal bankruptcy becomes national crisis. And that is the commentary that hides beneath the melodrama of this scenario. The American presidency is structurally unprepared for financial vulnerability. The founders imagined a corrupt monarch, but they did not imagine a bankrupt one. They imagined bribery, but they did not imagine leverage held by Gulf sovereign wealth funds or crypto billionaires. They imagined treason, but not cyber-laundered money or offshore investment vehicles registered in the Caymans. American constitutional design assumed that corruption would be political. It never anticipated that corruption would be architectural, financial, and asset-based. The 21st century broke the 18th century's imagination. The scenario also plays with a theme that vloggers love, the myth of inevitability. Trump marketed inevitability better than anyone in the modern political arena. From the escalator descent to the constant projection of winning, winning, and more winning. Inevitability was a brand, but inevitability is fragile. It only exists when observers believe in it. Once marshals show up with padlocks, inevitability evaporates. And when inevitability evaporates, so does fear. Trump's influence in the GOP was never truly ideological. It was fear-based. Fear of being primaried, fear of being humiliated, fear of being excommunicated from the base. Fear only functions when the emperor appears clothed. A seized tower is a naked emperor, and naked emperors rarely maintain grip on political parties. Now let's spend time on the scenario's psychological framing of corruption. It treats corruption not as a deviation from Trump's persona, but as the core of it. That is an important inversion. Mainstream discourse often frames Trump as a populist who later became corrupted by power. The scenario reframes Trump as a financial criminal who later became populist as a reaction to scrutiny. In other words, politics didn't corrupt the tycoon. Prosecution attempts politicize the tycoon. It's a powerful reframing because it situates the presidency as an extension of an illicit business model rather than an expression of ideology. It implies the presidency was a money laundering compliance failure, not a populist experiment. If that narrative were ever adopted widely in American culture, it would devastate populist movements that rely on authenticity. Nothing kills populism faster than the revelation that the champion of the people was actually a champion of foreign financiers. The scenario then raises an even darker implication: foreign infiltration through real estate. Intelligence agencies have been warning about real estate as a vehicle for foreign influence for more than a decade. The Five Eyes Alliance has published reports. EU regulatory watchdogs have issued advisories. Money laundering statutes have been amended. Oligarchs from Russia, the Middle East, China, Africa, and Southeast Asia all use real estate to part capital and influence. New York and Miami have been called the new Switzerland. Real estate doesn't just buy privacy, it buys citizenship, visas, social access, political invitations, and regulatory favors. If the scenario imagines that Trump's empire became a laundering mechanism for foreign capital, then it inadvertently touches a very real fear inside Western intelligence. National sovereignty can be bought with condos and penthouses. Tanks are obsolete, shell corporations are not. And yet, for all the geopolitical implications, what audiences remember, what sticks in the public psyche, are the visuals. the padlock on the gate of Mar-a-Lago, the gold letters coming down off a tower, the signs reading property of the United States government. Political commentary today is visual commentary. We live in the TikTok era. We live in the Telegram era. We live in the meme era. If someone can screenshot it, they can narrate it. If they can narrate it, they can weaponize it. And if they can weaponize it, they can mythologize it. The scenario understands this. It gives the audience imagery, not spreadsheets. And imagery is how you write history in a world with no attention span left. Another interesting dimension is the repayment theme. The scenario repeatedly insists that the buildings belong to the people all along, that Trump stole from the public and the government is merely repossessing stolen goods. This rhetorical move transforms asset seizure into restorative justice. And restorative justice narratives are incredibly powerful in populist media. When a billionaire loses a yacht, it is schadenfreude. When a billionaire loses a tower that was allegedly built with foreign bribes, it becomes moral accounting. And when that billionaire is a president, it becomes democracy reasserting sovereignty. That is the big narrative swing embedded here. Not punishment, but reclamation. Now let's explore the emotional ecology of Trump's base in such a scenario. The scenario imagines MAGA being told that the seizure is theft, but insists commentators correct them by saying Trump stole from them first. Whether or not that persuasion would work, it reveals something fundamental about political identity movements. They are built not on facts, but on emotional transactions. The emotional transaction at the heart of MAGA was not policy-based, it was revenge-based. Revenge against elites, revenge against institutions, revenge against globalization, revenge against cultural shifts. If Trump is ever reframed not as the weapon of revenge, but as the thief who robbed the base to maintain his lifestyle, then the emotional transaction collapses. And collapsed emotional transactions lead not to reconciliation, but to rage, disillusionment, or directionless chaos. The scenario even predicts cannibalism within the movement, with J.D. Vance becoming a scapegoat. That is exactly how revolutionary movements decay. They fracture into purity battles and counter-accusations. The enemy is no longer outside. The enemy is the traitor inside. Now we arrive at the downfall arc itself. The scenario describes Trump as a man stripped to nothing but crimes and panic. It portrays collapse not as an abrupt explosion, but as a slow unraveling of myth. The tower collapses metaphorically before it collapses financially. And this is where the political vlogger tone thrives, in cultural autopsy. Political commentary today isn't content with describing events. It wants to explain the soul of the moment. It wants to analyze not just what happened, but what it means for the American psyche, for the national identity, for the idea of democracy. The scenario declares democracy fighting back, and that phrase is doing a tremendous amount of work. It positions the entire saga as a morality play between corruption and institutions, between oligarchy and rule of law, between myth and accountability. That has been the central theme of the Trump era, both in reality and in fictional extrapolation. Does the law still matter? And if so, how much? The final irony is that Trump always framed himself as the breaker of norms, the destroyer of institutions, the anti-bureaucratic wrecking ball. But the scenario imagines him being destroyed not by a rival strongman or a populist uprising or a civil war, but by paperwork, by ledgers, by bank transfers, by asset forfeiture statutes, by court orders, by Marshals. It imagines Trump as a Caesar, felled by accountants. And that is deeply American. Because in America, the revolutionaries are auditors, not generals. We don't behead kings, we indict them. And yet the most fascinating part of this entire imagined downfall isn't the legal machinery or the geopolitical implications or even the humiliation factor. It's the cultural reckoning. Because if this scenario were real, America would be forced to admit something it has spent decades trying to deny. That corruption doesn't always wear uniforms or carry briefcases or speak with foreign accents. Sometimes corruption wears tuxedos at fundraisers. Sometimes corruption sits on the board of cultural institutions. Sometimes corruption owns golf courses and skyscrapers and pageants. Sometimes corruption appears glamorous, enviable, and patriotic. And sometimes the most corrupt figure in the country is not a spy or a bureaucrat or a cartel boss, but the president. A seizure of assets on the scale described in this scenario would puncture one of the last great American illusions, that wealth is inherently virtuous, that business success is inherently proof of genius, that capital accumulation equals moral credibility. Those illusions have shaped American politics since the Gilded Age. Trump didn't invent the conflation of wealth and virtue. He merely branded it better. But if the brand collapses, the illusion collapses with it, and as that cultural reckoning unfolds, the political class would scramble to reposition itself. Republicans would rewrite history at breathtaking speed, insisting they were always skeptical, always cautious, always uneasy, even as video archives insist otherwise. Democrats would declare vindication, but vindication doesn't repair institutional damage. Moderates would plead for stability, independents would demand accountability, and extremist factions would search for scapegoats. Media would feast, social platforms would explode, and political scientists would write think pieces titled "The End of the Billionaire Politician" or "The Fall of the Populist Tycoon." Meanwhile, the international community would be watching like a hawk. Allies would quietly sigh in relief at the idea that American institutions still function, while adversaries would weaponize the downfall to argue that American democracy is chaos in disguise. The United States loves exporting morality lectures. Adversaries love moments when those lectures boomerang. But the scenario has one more deliciously dark implication: the possibility that Trump would lash out, not with policy or media assaults, but with narrative sabotage. Because in a hyper-mediated era, the final weapon of a collapsing strongman is not tanks or decrees or emergency powers. It is story. He can claim victimhood. He can claim conspiracy. He can claim foreign sabotage. He can claim deep state treason. He can claim constitutional crisis. He can accuse judges, prosecutors, billionaires, allies, enemies, journalists, bankers, and even his own vice president. And the frightening thing about narrative sabotage is that it does not need to be true to be effective. It merely needs to sow enough confusion to make accountability feel like persecution. We have already seen the blueprint. The stolen election myth functioned not because of evidence. It functioned because it offered grievance. And grievance is the most addictive political substance in the modern world.